Margaret Dawson had spent most of her life believing that loyalty inside a family was unbreakable. For 30 years, she had built a career in corporate consulting, traveling across the country solving problems for companies that seemed impossible to fix. Yet on a quiet Monday morning in Miami, she discovered that the one relationship she thought was strongest might have been quietly collapsing behind her back. The lobby of the Seabreeze Towers was filled with a soft echo of footsteps and the hum of air conditioning. Sunlight poured through the tall glass entrance and reflected off the polished marble floor. Margaret walked inside with a small suitcase rolling behind her, still wearing the navy blazer she had worn during a long flight from Seattle. The trip had been exhausting but successful. Her firm had just closed the largest contract in its history, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could finally breathe. The building manager, Daniel Ortiz, stood behind the front desk flipping through paperwork. When he saw Margaret step into the lobby, his expression changed instantly. The friendly smile he normally greeted her with disappeared, replaced by something uneasy. "Mrs. Dawson, you're back," he said slowly. Margaret smiled politely, unaware of the tension. "Just landed an hour ago. How's everything here?" Daniel hesitated before answering. His eyes flicked toward a small envelope sitting on the desk beside him. He cleared his throat. "There's something I need to give you." Margaret frowned slightly, but walked over. Daniel slid the envelope across the counter toward her. Her name was written on the front in thin, slanted handwriting she immediately recognized. Olivia, her daughter-in-law. Margaret opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. The message was short, almost aggressively brief. "Please stop interfering in our lives. This has gone too far. We need space. Do not come to our apartment again." For several seconds, Margaret simply stared at the words. The letters seemed to blur slightly as if her brain refused to process them. "I don't understand," she murmured. Daniel shifted awkwardly. "They asked me not to let you into their unit anymore." The sentence landed like a sudden drop in an elevator. "My son asked that?" Margaret asked quietly. Daniel avoided her eyes. They both did. Margaret's fingers tightened around the note. Her son, Andrew, lived in the same building 3 floors below her. 2 years earlier, she had helped him purchase the luxury condo after he got engaged to Olivia. It had been a proud moment for her. Andrew had worked hard building his career in advertising, and she wanted him to start his marriage with security rather than stress. "Did they say why?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. Just that there had been tension. Tension. The word sounded absurd. Margaret had been out of town for 3 weeks negotiating a deal on the West Coast. Before she left, everything had seemed perfectly normal. She and Andrew had eaten dinner together the night before her flight. Olivia had been polite, maybe a little quiet as usual, but nothing had seemed wrong. Margaret slipped the note back into the envelope and placed it in her purse. "It must be some misunderstanding," she said. Daniel didn't reply. The elevator ride up to her floor felt strangely long. Margaret watched the numbers change slowly while memories of the last few months drifted through her mind. She tried to recall any argument, any harsh word, any moment that might explain this sudden hostility. Nothing came. When the elevator doors opened, her phone began vibrating in her purse. "Andrew." Margaret answered immediately. "Andrew? I just got back, and Daniel gave me—" "Mom," Andrew interrupted. His voice sounded distant. Not angry exactly, but cold in a way she had never heard before. "I think we need some space for a while." Margaret stood frozen in the hallway outside her apartment. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Olivia has been feeling overwhelmed," Andrew continued. "She says you've been constantly checking on us, dropping by, getting involved in things that aren't your business." Margaret blinked in disbelief. "I always call before I visit," she said slowly. "That's not the point," Andrew replied. "You're always around. It feels like you're monitoring everything we do." The accusation made no sense. Margaret had spent most of her career traveling. If anything, she worried she wasn't present enough in her son's life. When Andrew got married, she had deliberately tried to step back so the young couple could build their own routines. "Andrew," she said carefully, "has Olivia told you something about me?" Silence filled the phone. Then Andrew sighed. "She just wants peace. That's all." Margaret leaned against the wall. "I've been gone 3 weeks. That doesn't mean the pattern hasn't been there for years." The words struck deeper than he probably realized. Margaret had raised Andrew alone after her husband, Charles, died in a construction accident when Andrew was 10. Those years had been difficult. She had worked 2 jobs at one point, sometimes sleeping only 4 hours a night just to keep their home and pay for Andrew's school. Every decision she made had been about giving him stability. "Andrew," she whispered, "please talk to me in person." "Not right now." "Then when?" A pause followed. "Maybe in a few months." The sentence left Margaret speechless. "Months?" "I don't understand what happened," she said. Andrew's tone hardened slightly. "Olivia warned me this conversation would go this way. She said you'd pretend you didn't know what you were doing." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest.
Pretend?
Then another thought surfaced in her mind, a quiet truth she had hidden for years. "Andrew, does Olivia know who actually pays the condo maintenance fees?" "What?" Margaret closed her eyes. For 2 years she had been secretly covering most of those expenses. Andrew believed he was paying the full amount himself. Margaret had arranged it through an investment account, so the payments looked smaller. She never wanted him to feel dependent. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Andrew asked sharply. Margaret hesitated. "I was just helping," she said softly. "That's exactly the kind of manipulation Olivia warned me about." The accusation hit like ice water. "Andrew, listen. Please stop calling us," he said firmly. "Olivia is pregnant, and she doesn't need stress." Margaret's breath caught. "Pregnant? You're going to have a baby?"
Yes.
"And we need distance from conflict." The line went silent. Andrew had hung up. Margaret slowly unlocked her apartment and stepped inside. The quiet space felt larger than usual, almost hollow. Her eyes drifted to a photograph on the bookshelf. Andrew at 16, standing beside her at his high school graduation. Both of them smiling proudly. She picked up the frame and studied it. How could the same boy who once hugged her after every small achievement suddenly believe she was some kind of enemy? Margaret sank into the couch, the note still clutched in her hand. For the first time since her husband died 18 years earlier, she felt truly alone. And somewhere deep in her mind, a disturbing thought began to form. This situation hadn't appeared overnight. Someone had been quietly building it for a long time. And Margaret Dawson was starting to suspect exactly who. Margaret Dawson spent the next several days moving through her apartment, like someone wandering through a place that no longer belonged to her. The rooms were quiet in a way she had never noticed before. Normally, silence felt peaceful after weeks of traveling for work, but now it pressed against her ears with an uncomfortable weight. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, and she checked it constantly, hoping Andrew might call again. He never did. The note Olivia had written remained on the coffee table. Margaret had read it so many times that she could recite every word from memory. The handwriting was calm and precise, almost elegant. Yet the message itself carried an unmistakable coldness. "Stay out of our lives. We need distance." Each time Margaret read it, she tried to understand the logic behind it, but the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. 3 weeks earlier, Andrew had hugged her goodbye in the lobby before she left for Seattle. He had joked about watering her plants while she was away. Olivia had even asked Margaret to bring back a specific brand of chocolate from the airport shop because she had heard it was good during pregnancy. Nothing about that evening hinted that her presence was suddenly unbearable. By Thursday morning, Margaret realized she could not continue sitting alone with her thoughts. She needed to talk to someone who knew her well enough to challenge her assumptions. She picked up the phone and called the one person who had been part of her life longer than almost anyone else. "Linda," she said when the call connected, "are you free tonight?" Linda Harper had been Margaret's closest friend since college. The two women had met during their freshman year while working part-time in the campus library. Over the decades, they had survived marriages, losses, promotions, and relocations. If anyone could offer perspective, it was Linda. "Of course," Linda replied immediately. "You sound strange. What's going on?" "Dinner?" Margaret asked. 7 o'clock. My place. That evening, Margaret drove across town through the warm Florida twilight. Linda lived in a modest two-story house surrounded by palm trees and bright bougainvillea. The smell of garlic and roasted vegetables drifted through the open kitchen window as Margaret approached the front door. Linda greeted her with a hug the moment she stepped inside. "You look exhausted," Linda said. "I feel worse than I look." They settled at the dining table where Linda had prepared pasta and a bottle of red wine. For a few minutes, Margaret struggled to begin the story. But once the first sentence left her mouth, everything followed quickly. She described returning from her business trip, the envelope from Olivia, the conversation with Andrew, and the shocking accusation that she had been suffocating their marriage. Linda listened carefully, without interrupting. Only the occasional frown crossing her face revealed how troubled she felt. When Margaret finished, Linda leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "Something about this doesn't add up," she said slowly. "That's exactly how I feel." Linda took a sip of wine before continuing. "Andrew has always adored you. I've seen it since he was a kid. That kind of loyalty doesn't disappear overnight." Margaret stared at the table. "Apparently it can."
"No," Linda replied firmly.
Not without someone encouraging it. Margaret knew exactly what Linda was implying. "You think Olivia is behind this?" Linda shrugged slightly. "I think it's possible she's been influencing the situation more than you realize." Margaret had considered that thought during several sleepless nights, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real. Olivia had entered Andrew's life 4 years earlier during a marketing conference in Chicago. Andrew had called Margaret afterwards, sounding excited in a way she had rarely heard. He described Olivia as intelligent, ambitious, and independent. When Margaret met her months later, she had tried her best to welcome the young woman warmly. Yet there had always been something distant in Olivia's behavior. Polite smiles, careful compliments, but rarely genuine warmth. "Maybe I missed something," Margaret admitted quietly. "Maybe she's been unhappy for a long time, and I didn't notice." Linda shook her head. "Did she ever complain about you directly?"
"No."
"Did Andrew ever say you were interfering in their lives before this?" "Never." Linda leaned forward slightly. "Then think about the timing. You leave town for 3 weeks. While you're gone, Andrew suddenly decides you've been controlling him for years." Margaret frowned. "Are you suggesting Olivia used my absence to convince him of something?" "I'm suggesting that narratives are easier to build when the other person isn't there to defend themselves." Margaret felt a slow chill move through her chest. The idea seemed unsettlingly plausible. She remembered small moments now that she had ignored at the time. Olivia interrupting conversations when Andrew and Margaret reminisced about his childhood. Olivia making casual comments about how some mothers struggle to let go. Olivia occasionally referring to Margaret's support as interference. At the time, Margaret assumed those remarks were harmless observations. Now they felt like pieces of a much larger pattern. "What would she gain from turning Andrew against me?" Margaret asked. Linda didn't hesitate. "Control." The word hung in the air. "If Andrew sees you as a threat," Linda continued, "he'll depend on her emotionally. That shifts the balance of influence inside the relationship." Margaret sighed. "That sounds like something out of a psychological thriller." Linda raised an eyebrow. "You'd be surprised how often it happens." Margaret stared at her glass. Another troubling thought surfaced. Andrew mentioned something else during the call, she said slowly. What? Olivia told him I was manipulating their finances. Linda frowned.
How?
Margaret hesitated before explaining the truth about the maintenance payments she had secretly covered for 2 years. Linda listened with widening eyes. You never told him? She asked.
No.
I didn't want him to feel like he depended on me. Linda shook her head. Well, if Olivia discovered that arrangement, she could easily twist it into something sinister. Margaret rubbed her temples. She already has. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. The quiet allowed Margaret's mind to wander through old memories. She remembered the day Andrew was born during a summer thunderstorm. She remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle in the park near their house. She remembered the way he used to bring her coffee on Sunday mornings after he learned how to use the kitchen machine. Every stage of his life felt deeply connected to hers. The idea that someone had convinced him she was harmful seemed almost impossible to accept. I need to talk to him alone, Margaret said finally. Linda nodded slowly. That might be difficult if Olivia is determined to control the narrative. Then I'll find a way. Margaret's voice carried a quiet determination that surprised even her. She had spent decades solving complicated problems in corporate environments, negotiating between hostile executives, uncovering hidden agendas, restoring broken systems. Surely the relationship with her own son deserved at least the same level of effort. Linda studied her carefully. What are you planning? Margaret thought for a moment before answering. Andrew sometimes works remotely at a small cafe near the marina, she said. He mentioned it during one of our dinners. And Olivia usually has prenatal appointments on Wednesday mornings. A slow smile appeared on Linda's face. So, you're hoping to catch him alone? Margaret nodded. I don't want a confrontation. I just want him to hear the truth without someone else speaking for him. Linda raised her glass. Then Wednesday sounds like a very important day. Margaret lifted her own glass and clinked it gently against Linda's. For the first time since returning from Seattle, a small sense of purpose began to replace the helplessness she had been feeling. Somewhere in the city, Andrew Dawson still believed a version of reality that painted his mother as the villain. Margaret intended to change that, even if it meant uncovering truths that neither of them were ready to face. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of bright Florida sunlight that made the ocean shimmer like polished glass. Margaret Dawson had been awake since before dawn. She had tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, her thoughts circled back to the same question. Would Andrew even listen to her? The small cafe by the marina opened at 7. Margaret arrived at 8:30, earlier than necessary, but she needed time to steady herself. The place was quiet except for the soft hum of conversation from a few early customers and the faint sound of seagulls outside. She chose a table near the back where she could see the entrance without being obvious. From there she could watch the boats drifting slowly in the harbor through the large windows. Her hands rested on a leather folder sitting on the table. Inside were documents she had spent 2 sleepless nights gathering. Bank statements, email printouts, text messages, pieces of truth she hoped would break through the wall that had been built between her and her son. Margaret ordered a coffee but barely touched it. Every time the cafe door opened, her heart jumped slightly. A few office workers came and went. A group of students claimed a large table near the window. Time moved slowly. At 9:15 the door opened again. Andrew stepped inside. Margaret immediately recognized the familiar posture of his tall frame, though something about him looked different. His shoulders seemed tense, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes. He carried a laptop bag and scanned the cafe before heading toward a quiet table near the corner. Margaret waited a moment before standing. Each step toward him felt heavier than the last. When Andrew finally looked up and saw her approaching, his expression froze in surprise. Mom, Margaret stopped beside the table. Good morning, Andrew. For a moment neither of them spoke. Andrew glanced briefly toward the door, as if expecting Olivia to appear behind her. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Margaret sat down across from him before he could object. "I came for coffee." Andrew leaned back in his chair. "You don't come here." "I do today." He sighed quietly. "Mom, this isn't a good idea." Margaret nodded toward the folder. "Please just listen for a few minutes. That's all I'm asking." Andrew hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his laptop. "I only have about 40 minutes, he said finally. "Olivia has an appointment nearby." "That's enough." Margaret opened the folder slowly. Andrew's expression immediately grew cautious. "If this is about money again." "It isn't about money," she interrupted gently. "It's about truth." She slid the first document across the table. Andrew glanced down. It was a printed email. The sender's name at the top read, Olivia Dawson. The message was addressed to the building management office. "Please ensure Margaret Dawson is not allowed access to our unit while she is away. Andrew agrees this boundary is necessary." Andrew frowned. "What is this?" Margaret folded her hands calmly. "That email was sent 2 days before I returned from Seattle." Andrew stared at the date. His forehead creased slightly. "That doesn't make sense," he murmured. Margaret pulled out another sheet of paper. This one showed a series of text messages between her and Andrew from a month earlier. Andrew's own words were clearly visible. "Hey Mom, Olivia's new boss is visiting tonight. Want to come by and meet him?" Margaret watched as Andrew read the conversation slowly. "You told me I invited myself that night," she said quietly. Andrew read the messages again.
His jaw tightened.
I don't remember this." "That's why I printed it." Margaret placed a third document on the table. A bank statement. Several recurring payments were highlighted. "These are the condo maintenance fees," she explained. "They've been paid from my account for the past 2 years." Andrew looked up sharply. "You actually did that?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret paused. "Because your father hated asking for help. You inherited that same pride." Andrew leaned back, clearly struggling to process everything. "But Olivia said you were secretly controlling our finances." "I wasn't controlling anything," Margaret replied. "I was supporting you quietly." The cafe noise seemed to fade around them as Andrew studied the documents again. His confidence, once so firm during their phone conversation weeks earlier, was beginning to crack. Finally, he looked up. Why would Olivia lie about something like this? Margaret chose her next words carefully. "I don't know exactly what she told you over time," she said. "But some of the things she said about me simply aren't true." Andrew ran a hand through his hair. "She told me you showed up at our apartment unannounced all the time." Margaret gently slid another page forward. It showed call logs from her phone. Each visit had been preceded by a call. "I always asked first." Andrew stared at the page. Confusion began replacing the certainty that had guided him for weeks. "This doesn't make sense," he said quietly. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Andrew, I need you to think carefully. Did you ever personally witness me doing the things Olivia described?" Andrew opened his mouth but then stopped. The question lingered in his mind. Most of the accusations had come through conversations. Olivia telling him how uncomfortable she felt. Olivia explaining how Margaret's behavior seemed manipulative. But direct evidence? There had been very little. Andrew looked down at the folder again. "She told me you tried to make us financially dependent on you." Margaret shook her head. "I wanted you to feel independent, which is exactly why I kept the payment secret." Andrew's phone suddenly vibrated on the table. Olivia's name appeared on the screen. His eyes flicked toward Margaret and then back to the phone. He declined the call. For the first time, Margaret saw genuine uncertainty in her son's expression. "I don't understand what's happening anymore," Andrew admitted quietly. Margaret's voice softened. "That's because you've been hearing one version of events." Andrew stared out the window toward the marina for a long moment. "Mom, Olivia told me you were emotionally manipulating me. Margaret felt a brief sting but remained calm. If that were true, would I be sitting here asking you to look at evidence instead of demanding you believe me? Andrew said nothing. Another message appeared on his phone. Where are you? Olivia had written. Andrew locked the screen. She's going to be here soon, he said. Margaret nodded. That's okay. He hesitated before closing the folder halfway. Can I keep these? Margaret looked at him carefully. Will you be able to read them without someone taking them away? Andrew's silence answered the question. Margaret pushed the folder toward him. I have copies. Andrew placed it slowly into his bag. His movements carried the tension of someone standing at the edge of a difficult realization. I need time to think, he said. I understand. Andrew stood from the table. For a moment it seemed like he might say something more, but instead he simply adjusted the strap of his bag. Then he looked at her again. His voice was quieter than before. I don't hate you, Mom. Margaret felt a small wave of relief. I never believed you did. Andrew hesitated. I'll call you soon. Margaret nodded. I'll be here. He turned and walked quickly toward the door. Margaret remained seated, watching him disappear into the bright morning sunlight outside. A strange mix of emotions settled over her.
Hope, fear,
and the uneasy feeling that whatever happened next might change everything. Because if Andrew began questioning Olivia's story, there was no telling how she might react when she realized her control was slipping. And Margaret Dawson had a feeling that confrontation was coming sooner than anyone expected. 3 days passed after Margaret's meeting with Andrew at the Marina Cafe. They were the longest 3 days she had experienced in years. Every sound from her phone made her heart race, yet the screen remained stubbornly silent. No calls. No messages. Not even a short text to confirm that Andrew had looked through the documents she had given him. Margaret tried to keep herself occupied. She attended work meetings, reviewed client reports, and even went for long walks along the beachfront near her apartment building. But concentration came in brief bursts before dissolving into the same persistent thoughts. Somewhere across town, Andrew was sitting with a folder full of evidence that contradicted the narrative he had believed for months. Margaret could only imagine the conversations happening inside his apartment. Or perhaps there were no conversations at all. Perhaps the folder had been hidden somewhere Olivia would never find it. Late Saturday morning, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table reading through a contract when the sharp sound of her doorbell echoed through the apartment. She assumed it was a delivery driver and stood up slowly. But when she opened the door, the person standing in the hallway was the last one she expected. Olivia Dawson. The young woman stepped forward immediately without waiting to be invited inside. Her movements were quick and tense, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times before arriving. Margaret closed the door quietly behind them. Olivia turned toward her with eyes full of anger. You couldn't leave it alone, could you? She said. Margaret remained calm. Good morning, Olivia. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about, Olivia snapped. Meeting Andrew behind my back, showing him fake documents. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. Nothing I showed him was fake. Olivia laughed sharply. You're unbelievable. Margaret studied her carefully. Olivia's usual polished appearance seemed slightly strained today. Her hair was pulled back hastily, and there was a restless energy in the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. That tension told Margaret something important. Andrew had talked to her. You're worried, Margaret said quietly. Olivia's eyes narrowed. I'm not worried about anything. Then why are you here? For a moment Olivia didn't answer. Her gaze moved around the apartment, as if searching for something. You're trying to manipulate him again, she said finally. Exactly like I warned him. Margaret folded her arms gently. By showing him facts. Olivia scoffed. You think printing papers makes them true? Margaret tilted her head slightly. Did Andrew show you the folder? That question struck a nerve. Olivia's expression tightened. He told me everything. Margaret noticed the careful wording. Not he showed me everything.
Just he told me.
Which meant Olivia probably hadn't seen the documents herself. That must have been an interesting conversation, Margaret said. Olivia stepped closer, lowering her voice. You need to stay away from my family. The emphasis on the word my did not go unnoticed. Andrew is my son, Margaret replied calmly. He's my husband, Olivia shot back. For a moment silence hung between them. Margaret could see anger building behind Olivia's eyes, but beneath that anger there was also something else.
Fear.
You know, Margaret said slowly, Andrew seemed very confused after reading those documents. Olivia's jaw tightened. You're twisting things. Am I? Margaret walked toward the living room and gestured toward the sofa. If you're going to accuse me of something, at least sit down. Olivia remained standing. I'm not here to chat. Then what are you here for? The question lingered in the air. Olivia hesitated. Margaret suddenly realized something. Olivia hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to intimidate. You're pregnant, Margaret said quietly. You shouldn't be under this much stress. Olivia's hand instinctively moved toward her stomach. Exactly, she replied. Which is why you need to stop causing problems. Margaret studied her carefully. Did Andrew know you were coming here today? The reaction was immediate. Olivia's eyes flickered away. No, she admitted quickly, then corrected herself. He doesn't need to know about every conversation I have. Margaret nodded slowly. That's interesting. Olivia's patience snapped. Listen carefully, she said, her voice rising. Andrew believes me. He knows how controlling you've always been. That folder you showed him won't change anything. Margaret walked to her desk and opened a drawer. Olivia watched with suspicion. What are you doing? Margaret removed her checkbook. I'm trying to understand something, she said. Olivia frowned. Margaret sat down at the desk and began writing. The scratching sound of the pen filled the quiet room. After a moment, she tore the check from the book and stood up. Maybe this will make things simpler. She handed it toward Olivia. Olivia glanced down. Her eyes widened slightly. The amount written on the check was $50,000. What is this? Olivia asked cautiously. An offer. For what? Margaret's voice remained steady. You seem very determined to keep Andrew away from me. If that's truly what you want, perhaps we can reach an agreement. Olivia stared at the check. You're trying to buy me? No, Margaret said calmly. I'm giving you an opportunity. Olivia hesitated. What kind of opportunity? Margaret met her eyes. You take the money. I stop contacting Andrew. Completely. Olivia's breathing slowed slightly. The tension in her posture shifted from anger to calculation. And that's it, she asked. That's it. For a long moment, Olivia said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the check. Margaret watched carefully. The silence revealed more than any argument could have. Finally, Olivia reached forward and took the check. Well, she said coolly, sliding it into her purse, at least you're capable of making a smart decision. Margaret nodded slightly. I'm glad we understand each other. Olivia turned toward the door, but paused before leaving. You should know something, she added with a faint smile.
Andrew chose me.
Not you. Margaret didn't react. Goodbye, Olivia. The younger woman left the apartment with quick, confident steps.
The door closed.
For several seconds, Margaret simply stood there in silence. Then she walked slowly toward the bookshelf where a small black security monitor sat beside the television. The screen displayed the recording from her living room camera. Every word of the conversation had been captured. Margaret picked up her phone and called Linda. She took it, Margaret said when her friend answered. The check. Yes. Linda let out a quiet whistle. So, it really was about money. Margaret looked back at the screen where Olivia's image had been frozen mid-conversation. Partly, she replied. And Andrew? Margaret sighed softly. That part is still up to him. Linda was silent for a moment. You're going to show him the video eventually? Only if necessary. Margaret ended the call and sat down slowly on the sofa. Outside her window, the afternoon sun reflected off the ocean again, just as it had the day she returned from Seattle. But now the situation had changed. Olivia believed she had secured her victory. Andrew was somewhere in the middle of a story that was beginning to unravel. And Margaret Dawson knew one thing with certainty. The truth had finally started moving. Sooner or later, it would reach her son. The only question was what Andrew would do when it did. Winter arrived slowly in Miami, not with snow or bitter winds, but with cooler evenings and a softer golden light that lingered longer over the ocean. 6 months had passed since Olivia walked out of Margaret Dawson's apartment with a $50,000 check in her purse. During those months, Margaret made a deliberate decision that surprised even herself. She did nothing. She never contacted Andrew again. She never mentioned the video recording to anyone except Linda. She focused on her work, accepted 2 major consulting contracts, and even began volunteering twice a week at a literacy center that helped adults learn basic reading skills. Her life filled with routines again, but the quiet space where Andrew once existed remained impossible to ignore. Every Sunday, she still prepared too much food out of habit. Every time she passed the Marina Cafe, she felt a small tightening in her chest. And sometimes at night, she would catch herself staring at the old photographs in her living room, remembering how Andrew used to decorate the Christmas tree with her every year. The check Olivia had taken was cashed within 4 days. Margaret saw the notification through her banking app late one evening after returning from work. She stared at the transaction confirmation for several seconds before closing the screen. Linda had been furious when she heard the news. "That woman practically proved your entire theory," her friend had said. "You could send the evidence to Andrew right now." But Margaret refused. "If he discovers the truth himself, it will mean something," she explained. "If I force it on him, he might only see it as another manipulation." So she waited. Autumn faded quietly into December. Christmas decorations began appearing throughout the city. The lobby of Margaret's building filled with garlands and small lights wrapped around the staircase railings. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret stood in her living room assembling her Christmas tree. It was slightly smaller than the one she usually bought. The large ornaments Andrew loved placing on the branches still sat inside a storage box she hadn't opened. Soft holiday music played from the kitchen while she worked. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine that Andrew might walk through the door like he used to during the holidays. The thought faded quickly. Then the doorbell rang. Margaret assumed it was a delivery driver bringing the new ornaments she had ordered online. She brushed pine needles from her sweater and walked toward the door. When she opened it, she froze. Andrew stood in the hallway. For several seconds, neither of them moved. He looked different than the last time she had seen him at the Marina Cafe. His posture was slightly hunched, as if he had been carrying a heavy weight for too long. Dark circles under his eyes suggested many sleepless nights. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. "Andrew." Another long pause passed between them before he spoke again. "Can I come in?" Margaret stepped aside immediately. "Of course." Andrew entered the apartment slowly. His gaze moved around the living room, lingering on the half-decorated Christmas tree standing near the window. "You still put it up early," he murmured. Margaret smiled faintly. "That hasn't changed." Andrew walked toward the tree and picked up a silver star lying on the coffee table. It was the same star his father had bought during their first Christmas together many years earlier. "You kept this," Andrew said. "Always." He placed it gently back on the table before turning toward her. "I made a huge mistake," he said. Margaret did not interrupt. She simply gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" Andrew nodded. They sat across from each other at the same small kitchen table where Andrew had spent years doing homework as a teenager. Margaret poured coffee into 2 mugs and added cream to his exactly the way he liked it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Andrew exhaled slowly. Olivia and I separated 2 months ago. Margaret remained calm, though the news surprised her. I'm sorry you're going through that. Andrew shook his head. You should hear the whole story first. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug as if gathering strength. I found the check. Margaret waited. I was looking for a receipt in Olivia's purse, Andrew continued. Instead, I saw a bank statement. He paused.
$52,000.
Deposited the same day. She told me she came here to make peace with you. Margaret said nothing. Andrew continued speaking, his voice growing heavier with each sentence. When I asked her about it, she said you tried to bribe her to keep quiet about something. But the explanation didn't make sense. He stared down at the table. So, I checked the building security footage from that afternoon. Margaret's eyes softened. You saw her come here. Andrew nodded slowly. And I saw how angry she looked when she arrived. Silence filled the kitchen. Andrew continued. Then I went through the folder you gave me again. I read every document carefully. His voice broke slightly. You were telling the truth. Margaret reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. Andrew swallowed hard. I also checked our financial records. You really had been paying the maintenance fees all along. Yes. Andrew looked at her with visible regret. And I believed her when she said you were manipulating me. Margaret squeezed his hand. You loved her. That's not an excuse, he said quietly. For a moment his composure collapsed. Tears filled his eyes. I accused you of trying to control my life. I sent you legal threats. I cut you out completely. Margaret moved from her chair and stood beside him. You were confused, she said softly. I was blind. Andrew covered his face with his hands. I don't deserve forgiveness. Margaret wrapped her arms around him the same way she had when he was a child. You already have it. For several minutes, Andrew simply sat there while the tension of the past 6 months finally released. When he eventually looked up again, his expression had softened. There's something else, he said. Margaret returned to her chair. Olivia is pregnant. I know. Andrew looked surprised. You do. You mentioned it during our last phone call. He nodded slowly. It's a girl. Margaret smiled gently. That's wonderful. Andrew exhaled. The divorce will be finalized after the baby is born. We've agreed on shared custody. Margaret studied him carefully. That won't be easy. I know. He paused before speaking again. But I want you to be part of her life. Margaret felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. I would like that very much. Andrew looked around the living room again before standing. Can we finish decorating the tree together? Margaret smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. They spent the next hour placing ornaments on the branches exactly as they had done every December since Andrew was a child. The familiar rhythm returned easily. Laughter appeared occasionally, breaking the tension that had hung between them for months. Finally, Andrew picked up the silver star. Ready? He asked. Margaret nodded. He climbed onto the small step stool and carefully placed the star at the top of a tree. When he stepped down, Margaret noticed something familiar in his expression, the same quiet determination his father once carried. 6 months earlier, she had feared their relationship might be permanently broken. But some bonds were stronger than manipulation, stronger than misunderstanding, stronger even than time. And as the Christmas lights reflected softly across the room, Margaret realized something important. Truth rarely needs to shout. If it waits patiently, eventually it finds its way home.